This is really a space that when you look at sort of the vast range of energy policy, this is one that has relatively few political problems. There is a ton we need to do for our grid, lots of different problems we have to tackle. This is what we like to call a no-regret solution.
The U.S. transmission grid is in need of a facelift and maybe some reconstructive surgery. Efforts are underway to construct some new long-distance high-voltage lines that we desperately need, but building stuff takes time, encouraging states to explore additional ways to quickly meet growing electricity demand. There is a low-hanging fruit, and it's getting more out of the system we've already got. Readily available, affordable, and quick-to-deploy advanced transmission technologies, or ATTs, including grid-enhancing technologies, or GETs, and advanced conductors, are proven tools for quickly increasing the capabilities and capacities of transmission lines and could complement transmission build-out while saving consumers money and bolstering grid reliability. By one estimate, GETs alone could have saved consumers more than $8 billion just in 2022, had they been more widely used. Yet these technologies remain largely untapped in the United States today, in part due to outdated electricity business models and state public policy. But modern problems, looking at you, aforementioned load growth, require modern solutions, and recently there's been a real uptick in support for ATTs and GETs across the country, including bipartisan interest in policies that ensure they're being used, and at the federal level, where FERC is now requiring ATTs to be considered per its show cause orders to major grid operators earlier this summer. On this edition of the Factor This Policycast, presented in partnership with Advanced Energy United, I'm joined by Theodore Paradise, Chief Policy and Grid Strategy Officer at CTC Global, Brian Barry, Chief Product Officer at Heimdall Power, and Leah Rubin-Shen, Managing Director at Advanced Energy United, to discuss why there's been such a surge of support for GETs and things like it. We're going to dive into the problems they're solving for states and how lawmakers are crafting legislation to ensure utilities consider ATTs and provide updates on efforts in states that are actively looking at what GETs can do for their grids. Let's start with some brief introductions in case you're unfamiliar with the characters in the show. Let's start with Leah, Managing Director at Advanced Energy United, her first time on the Policycast. Leah, thanks for joining us. Tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about the perspective you bring to this issue.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. So as you mentioned, I'm a managing director at Advanced Energy United. My beat is the Western states. I oversee all of our engagement in the West. And Advanced Energy United, as listeners of the podcast may already know, we are a multi-technology trade association. We predominantly engage at the state level and in some of the wholesale markets around the country. And we have a really diverse membership, all kinds of technologies that get deployed on the grid, as well as transportation and building electrification technologies. And one thing I'll say here is we have 3 goals for the grid when we think about what we need to do to make it what it needs to be. We want to build it, we want to make it flexible, and we want to make it affordable. One of my favorite things about advanced transmission technologies, or ATTs, is that they help with all 3 of those goals. So I'm very excited to be here to talk about this topic today.
Thanks, Leah. Let's kick it over to Theodore Paradise at CTC Global. I'm just going to say this once, Theodore. You've got an amazing name. I'm sure you heard it once or twice, but I've been thinking about it ever since. And if there's a way I could steal not your identity, but just your name, I would.
There may be. Let's talk through. Well, Paul, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on. It's a really important topic. I loved Leah's intro because she had a great encapsulation about what ATTs can do for the grid. And that's very much on my mind as we kind of are in this season of historic load growth on the one hand, and on the other side of the equation, historic generation supply. And so you think, I had, Econ 101 in college, I've got supply and demand, everything should be fine. But the thing sitting in the middle of that equation is the grid. And it is a bit of a canyon between those 2 pieces. So my background is, energy lawyer for, a California ISO back in the Enron days and moving through many years at an ISO or RTO in New England. And looking at the transmission planning rules and FERC going through the iterations as RTOs became a thing, leading up to where we are now, and that shift from either flat or very incremental load growth to a time when the numbers we're talking about seem absurd. When I hear numbers like in Texas, where there's several hundred gigawatts of supply waiting to serve hundreds of gigawatts of potential new load on a peak load of 85 gigawatts. It's such a unprecedented time. So the perspective I bring to this is, having seen how long it takes to upgrade that grid that sits in between the supply and the demand, what can we do to both make that much faster? Speed to power is how I think we're talking about it these days often, and much more affordable, because that has started to loom large. And I'm sure we'll talk today about things like the Ratepayer Protection Pledge and similar sorts of initiatives we see out there. So I'm excited to dig into this conversation with you, Leah and Brian, and maybe help your listeners understand what some of the low-hanging fruit might be out.
Yeah, thank you, Theodore. It's really hot down in ERCOT right now. They're breaking demand records the week of this recording. They've topped 90 gigawatts. And the best part of it, though, and not to get too far off into the weeds, is that the power prices stayed kind of meh. And they had about 20 gigawatts to play with, which is very different than a few summers ago before the saturation of solar and batteries like ERCOT has now in 2026. But anyway, not to keep the people from hearing from Brian for 1 second longer. Brian Berry, Chief Product Officer at Heimdall Power. Been following what you guys have been doing for a long time. Great to have your perspective on the show. Tell the people what you're all about.
Thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here and wonderful to talk about this and see how we can improve the grid. Heimdall is an Oslo-based tech company where we've built sensors and software that the sensors can go on the line. The software can help interpret that data from those sensors and help utilities push more through their more power through their lines, but also to understand a little bit more about these assets that have been relatively dumb for a number of years. And when I refer to that, I'm talking about the conductors, the lines that are traveling many, many miles over the land. Bringing a bit more insight into that, we live in a data age where you can bring in a lot of data and it can tell you stuff that you never knew before, and there's a lot of opportunity there. Myself, just a bit of a background. I once upon a time, I was a power system engineer and worked in control centers around the world, and moved over to the vendor space, really trying to push solutions into the spaces which sometimes I thought, hey, this is obvious. Why don't we do that? And through the years, through the experience working in both Europe and America, seeing the technical problems, the people problems, the commercial problems, and then, of course, the regulatory problems. And all of these barriers that, only when you get all of those recipes together and in the right mix, then you can blast through. You can have a great technology, but if you have the wrong timing, the wrong market, it's not going to happen. Same thing. You can have the regulation, but you don't have the vendors to support that. So it's really quite exciting, I think, in the GETS and ATT space right now, to see that I think the stuff's really coming together, and it's coming together exactly because of that need we're seeing. There's exciting stuff happening in the grid today. It's a challenge we haven't seen for the last 100 years. And I think it's our opportunity as grid people to stand up and take that opportunity, right? So I think that's really good stuff.
Thanks for joining the show, Brian. It's going to be great to have your perspective paired with Theodore's. Two very dissimilar technologies driving at the same goals that Leah is trying to make sure get incorporated into the legislation that is guiding how states are approaching these issues. All of you kind of touched on how grid congestion is a problem, and we all know we've got an aging grid that's in desperate need of modernization. As we sort of look through that lens at the way that state lawmakers are thinking about approaching ATTs and GETs, Leah, how are we thinking about ensuring that we're designing the right kind of language in those laws that make sure that utilities and grid operators look into the technologies that Theodore and Brian are out there producing?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It is a great question, right? I mean, the devil is always going to be in the details when it comes to writing a bill. I will say that of the bills we've seen around the country on this, they're all pretty similar at a high level. There are nuances around, definitions that might already be in statute or processes that already exist in states. But for the most part, what they are asking to have happen is that the utilities examine at some point in their process how these technologies can be deployed as they're thinking about their transmission system. So in some states where they might do regular transmission plans, we say, hey, you should be looking at advanced transmission technologies as part of those plans, factor them into your plans. In some states, it's more at the CPCN level, when they're actually applying to build the line and they want to make sure that the commission is going to give them, rate recovery for that. The commission, directed by the legislature, saying to them, you got to make sure that, all of your investment is prudent. And part of how you're going to prove that to us is by looking and seeing where these technologies could be deployed on the system. And I think one of the reasons that, these technologies are having a moment for state lawmakers is because they are really an affordability solution. That's a big concern all across the country right now. Lawmakers in every state, Republican, Democrat, regardless of sort of what's happening in the state locally, they're all hearing about energy affordability. They're hearing about it from their constituents. It's very much top of mind for them. And so this is a solution that when they hear about it, they're like, oh, that seems like a pretty common sense thing. We should probably be doing that. Yeah. Let's do that. Let's write a bill. And we're off to the races.
We're going to talk in just a second about some recent state efforts and some encouraging news in that regard. But before we do, I want to give Theodore and Brian a chance to explain what their technologies do, because we've been painting a pretty broad brush around what ATTs and GETs are. And I think it's important to understand the differences between advanced conductoring and what Heimdall Power is putting up on lines, and exactly how those make a difference for the stakeholders involved.
There's a lot of discussion around advanced conductors or high performance conductors, the kind of interchangeable terms. And what I find is that while it's easy to say that, if you double click into it, the understanding of what that means is often incomplete or just not accurate at times. So what an advanced conductor is, and I'm going to show you some things so people seeing this can see it, but I'll try to describe it for folks who are just listening too. So when we started the power grid back, beginning of last century, we had a design for transmission lines, super functional. We had steel in the core of transmission lines that provided the structural support. We wrapped that in aluminum, and the aluminum is what carries the electric field. It is the means by which the energy really travels. And that works great, and it's worked really well for over 100 years in the system. But there are some design limitations, and you run into this in system planning. So Brian, with his background, would have seen the system, the line rating limits. And this is where, when Brian talks about line ratings, temperature matters, right? So especially in this design, if you think about why an electric stove works, you put a lot of power through metal, it gets hot. The other thing that happens with metal when it gets hot, and this is why we can make a horseshoe, right, is it becomes pliable. So we create the thermal limit of the line by that reaction of how much heat is going through that conductor. There's a resistance to it. And when that steel starts to become pliable, it sags. So you've got to make it so you don't damage the line, sagging it too much, or even sagging it into trees or sagging it into the ground if you keep going. So 20 years ago, or a little bit more, some aerospace folks, thought about, what if we take the steel out of the middle of the conductor and replace it with a carbon fiber composite? We have jets that are made out of carbon fibers. We have like 5-to-1 strength ratio when you're talking about carbon fiber and steel. But the other piece of information that really sort of makes the whole story make sense is, okay, it's stronger, it can carry more weight, but it doesn't react with heat. So as that power increases and goes through, the line doesn't sag. It's got a little bit just because the aluminum gets warm, but then it stops. And so you can put more aluminum on it because of the weight and the strength. And so just by changing the wire on existing structures, you can double the amount of power that can go through that existing right-of-way. And if you think about how long it takes to build a power line, 7 years, 10 years, sometimes more, this is a process that can take 8 months, 12 months, 14 months. And we have done this all over the globe in 70 countries. We've got 5 factories globally, our largest in the US where we're headquartered. and 140,000 or so miles deployed at this point. It's interesting. This podcast, I think, is going to be consumed by a lot of listeners in the US. 92% of that is outside of the US in terms of the deployment that we've had to date. And I think we'll get into what the drivers are, why that's changing, some of what Lee is seeing on the legislation. But those characteristics of the technology are why it's having a moment, because speed is incredibly important and affordability is incredibly important. And if we're talking about transmission capacity, it's a shorthand way of saying I can add more generation to the grid, and I can move that generation around. So I'm not running into the congestion that you're talking about. Now, all of that translates into lower energy prices. So it's a really significant both growth story and a cost affordability story.
And a lot of the strengths of reconductoring are shared by what Heimdall Power is doing, although they come at it from an entirely different perspective. Tell us about the magic ball, Brian.
Yeah, no, happy to. So the magic ball, we didn't come up with the name, the nickname anyways, that followed us from some magazine article a couple of years ago. So the magic ball, which we lovingly call the neuron, it's a sensor that is about the size of a bowling ball, just shy of 8 pounds. And this gets attached to transmission lines or distribution lines. And it's got a bunch of sensors in there. One of the cool things about our sensor is that it can be mounted by drone. So you stick it into a drone, fly it up there, and even more than that, the drone actually can fly itself. The pilot gets it close to the line, drone takes over, attaches the neuron to the line, and within a matter of seconds, we have it attached and ready to go. And once this sensor's on the line, it really, as I say, starts to make these relatively simple. I'm insulting Theodore here, saying lines are simple. How dare I? How dare I? No, but these pieces of metal out there in the wilderness, bringing some sensor technology, some diagnostics back that we can then start to understand this. But of course, one of the main use cases is dynamic line rating. Or what a lot of people will say, DLR. The utility business has no shortage of TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. So DLR, what it does is we're basically measuring the state of the conductor. We're measuring how much it's sagging, measure the conductor temperature and that sort of thing. And this is highly affected by the weather. Is it cold? Is it windy? Is the sun shining, not shining? And the way that line ratings worked traditionally and continue to work today is you choose the worst day of the year. So you say, okay, listen, I'm going to choose the hottest day, the day with absolutely zero wind, and I'm going to rate my line as if it's like that all the time. With dynamic line rating, what we do is we actually understanding the state, the weather, and all of that. We can even forecast it within a couple of days. And we can then utilize that extra capacity. So, it's not always the height of summer. The sun is not always shining. The wind is not, always sitting still. So we can take that actual weather data and then utilize that. So when there is a bit of relief from the weather, we can push more power through the grid. Now, it leans into a word that Leah mentioned, and that is flexibility. Flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. If we want to utilize the grid more effectively, we have to embrace flexibility. Now, there's a cost. What is the cost? The cost is complexity. We have to just accept that it is going to be more complicated. It isn't just going to be static rules. We're going to have to be able to move up and down. But there are technologies, huge amounts of technologies. There's a huge amount of sensor data, there's a huge amount of computing power, and then in this day and age, AI that can actually empower this flexibility. It doesn't have to be so terrifying. And if we're not scared of that flexibility and that complexity, well, then there's a lot of benefit to be had. So that's Heimdall. I think it would be wrong of me, although Heimdall represents the dynamic line rating space, I think GETS, there's a couple of acronyms, and maybe I just want to represent for the friends that I have out there. As I say, 3-letter acronyms. The first one, ATTs, gets and IGTs. Oh my goodness, three acronyms for almost the same thing. So gets in America, grid enhancing technologies, covers DLR, advanced power flow control, and topology optimization. ATTs, advanced transmission technologies, takes that same subset and just adds advanced conductors, what CTC and others produce. And then IGTs, in Europe, we don't like to keep anything simple. We don't like to, copy anyone. We just make it up and make it very complex. We call them IGTs, innovative grid technologies. And basically, anyone who's got a great idea, come on in. So take ATTs and throw a couple of extra clever ideas in there, and that's what you have, IGTs. So if you care, those are the acronyms. That's what it means.
I appreciate you explaining all that. That's good alphabet soup for all the listeners and viewers out there. And I can see why some legislators might be a little fearful to wade into that pool of alphabet soup and try to make sense of it. But Leah, as we mentioned at the top of the show, and as I know you're very much aware, there's been some encouraging movement within the states about adopting these sorts of technologies. Now that we better understand what they are and what they can do, where are we at progress-wise across the U.S., especially out in your neck of the woods out west?
I think one of the things that's been very encouraging is that these bills are passing in states across the political spectrum, right? So we've seen bills pass in Colorado and California, in Maryland, and New Jersey. We've also seen them pass in Utah and Indiana and Montana. So they really are having a sort of a bipartisan moment, if you will. And a lot of these bills in all of these states, regardless of sort of who controls the legislature or who's in the governor's office, are getting bipartisan support. I also wanted to mention, coming on the heels of sort of talking about what the technologies are, getting the definitions right in these bills has been another really important component of them. We have been favoring the term advanced transmission technologies, as Brian mentioned, because it encompasses both the GETs and the advanced conductors. Those are both types of companies we have in our membership, and that sort of, I think, captures the pretty full universe of what we're trying to achieve. We also, see in these bills, for the most part, sort of a deference to usually the Public Utility Commission or Public Service Commission in the state saying, this is the kind of technology we're talking about. Anything else that comes along that kind of fits into this bucket, you have the discretion to include at any time and have the utilities include that in their evaluations. So I think getting back to flexibility, I think that kind of flexibility, definitional flexibility, is also really important in thinking about how you craft the legislation.
I've got a follow-up, though. How flexible do you want the language to be in terms of adoption? Because I know there's a big difference between having to consider something and having to use something. Which have you seen more of, and which would you prefer?
Also a good question. I think, none of these bills are mandating specific use on specific lines, right? They're never that prescriptive. I think that would not be an appropriate role for a legislature to take anyway. And usually, I think, as far as it goes, is a requirement that the utilities really strongly consider, and then there's some kind of backstop mechanism if they don't. So what we have in the Colorado bill that just passed earlier this year, for example, is they kind of have to show their work. They have to evaluate ATTs in their transmission plans, and they have to explain why they're not using them if they choose to not use them. And then that gives the commission an opportunity to go and say, hey, you decided to build a whole new line here instead of using an ATT. Tell us more about that, defend yourself. And maybe they have a good reason for it. Maybe they don't. But then you can kind of have that dialogue in the regulatory process where they're really, there's that oversight function that the regulators can perform. Some states, it's a little more permissive. It just says, you got to consider these. You got to look at them, and what does that consideration look like? It can be, a single page. It could be, more involved. It kind of depends, again, on to what extent the regulators who are, the PUCs who are usually the ones in charge of, implementation, how strict do they want to be and how much do they want to hold the utilities accountable to that process?
And Paul, can I add on to what Leah just said, that what she observed, to agree with all of it. I think what I've noted too is in that spectrum that Leah just sent out, I've seen sort of what the states are doing, what AU is doing with some of the legislation, and we saw this in the FERC orders that just came out. They learn from the last bit of legislation that's come out. So if I went back, let's say 24 months ago, I think it would be a much closer to consider, take a look at. if you look at some of the comments the commissioners made at FERC in issuing the June order to the RTOs, Commissioner Rosner is very clear. You have to look at these, right? It's not a check the box exercise. To what Leah was just saying, FERC was very clear in both some of those commissioner comments and the orders themselves. And you've got to show your work. You've got to explain what you've done here. And if you don't select advanced transmission technology, you need to explain why you're not making that choice. And the piece that went with that the commission added was, and you need to be using tools that can actually be modeling the benefits of those technologies. I think that this is really important, and I think we'll see more of that kind of language. To what Leah just mentioned, that the definitions tend to sort of set a floor, but then anything better the states can consider, for example, or the transmission planners can incorporate. It's a time of incredible change. I mean, I didn't see real change in the transmission space for most of the first part of my career, and now it's all the time. There's the stuff that Brian is doing with the bolt-ons to the lines, which can work on existing lines. In our space, a few years ago, we started to put fiber optics into the lines themselves to just measure line health. And then this year we launched Grid Vista, which is an always live sensor. This, you're doing the reconductoring to get the capacity, or it reduces losses by up to 40% too. There are various reasons to reconduct or use them on greenfield lines. But now within the line itself, it's measuring sag, temperature, strain. If there's a branch on the line, you can see it. If there's a gunshot damage to the line, you can see it. And as Brian noted, that can be, connected up with AI tools to have a lot of real world awareness with a grid that can now feel on, whether it's new lines, with that inside the line itself, or on existing lines where, Brian's DLR equipment and sensor equipment is being put on that, gives the grid a whole new level of awareness and efficiency. And I think that goes to the heart of that floor, but you can do better. I think legislators are now understanding that technology is moving in this space quickly, and to the heart of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's comments of, you got to get tools out there that are measuring these benefits, because these benefits are fantastic. Again, if you went back a few years in transmission planning, my goodness, as Brian said, it's a lot of data. So there is a potential burden that comes with that, but there's a lot of innovation that's coming along as these technologies develop, so that planners and operators can actually use this data.
I know part of the conversation is not just warming up the legislators to these ideas too. Part of it is warming up the utilities. And that's a space I know Heimdall Power has been really active in. I remember the beginning conversations with you guys working out in Minnesota, trying to convince the utilities to just do one drone demonstration. Let us just show you that we can put this thing up on a line without having a big issue. Would love to hear your perspective on what it takes to make the right regulatory decisions that allow for your technology to be deployed, Brian, and two, how you've sort of overcome those tricky conversations with utilities about getting your stuff out there.
Wow, I mean that's quite a question. I think if I knew the answer to how to get the regulation right or the utilities right, I would be absolutely fine.
You'd be leading the program for sure.
I'd be sorted. But no, look, I think it's a complex topic. There's a lot of questions around who benefits, who pays, and getting that balance right is never easy. I think one thing that I've learned experiencing this both in Europe and America, it's quite interesting to see the two. I think that there are two distinct methodologies. I think Europe tries to do the incentive-based approach. And I think America, for lack of a better a word, sort of the whip, carrot versus whip approach. Now, it's not really a whip, it's legislation. It's saying you should consider this, you should try. It's encouraging. What Europe is trying is it's trying to say, listen, here's a problem in the grid. It costs X. At the end of the day, it's going to consumers. It's this amount per annum. Here's the key points, trying to put a price to that. and then saying, if you're able to solve this price in a non-traditional way, or a cheap or a cost-effective way or whatever, then you can have a share of those. Now, that in itself is very, very complicated. But it is interesting to see. And one thing I've learned from the European experience is it just like anything in tax, is you've got to get the numbers right. If you don't get that incentive right, people don't get up in the morning for certain amounts of money, right? And to compare to the capital gains, the typical business of transmission, these are very difficult things to solve. So I don't think there's any silver bullet, unfortunately, on the regulatory side. That's why I'm glad to have Leah and the likes, helping on this in this situation. But what we try to do is we try to go to the utilities and say, okay, listen, where are you at? What are the things? Where are your gains? Where are your pains? And it's not always about congestion. It's not about like, okay, I installed this, and because I did this, the congestion price went down. In a lot of cases, especially Minnesota, and that it's to show, even though they're not directly incentivized as utilities to do this, they do it because it's the right thing to do. And especially with co-ops and munis, these guys are really in it for the people, or at least in theory, that's what it's supposed to be. And I definitely see parts of that. And I even see IOUs behaving in that way, where it's like, look, this is the right thing to do. Affordability, customer satisfaction are things that we care about. The one way I heard it described was basically customer satisfaction is a cliff. We don't know where that cliff is, but we know if we fall off that cliff, it's horrible to come back. We've seen a few examples of that in the US. We don't ever want to fall off that cliff. So we'll throw some money at this and throw some ideas around. And, personally, I'll take it. I love these forward-thinking utilities, and we've had a few of them over the years out in Minnesota area as well. They really took a dive, tried and said, what's the worst that can happen? And as you say, allowed us to come and show them, we think this is a cool idea. This is what some of the guys in Europe are doing. Let us show you. We brought along a drone. Just recently, we brought along a drone and showed it at NARUC. And that was really, I think, practical. So often regulation, as you say, we can get stuck in the weeds. We can get stuck in the acronyms and the words, But fundamentally, you see this, you're like, hey, this isn't rocket science. It's possible. We've got over 400 sensors in the US installed at the moment, and the majority of those were actually done with drone. And people think, this is far away. There's a lot of legislation. Maybe you can fly a drone, but do you have the licenses? Well, we've done it, and showing to people and having those early adopters in utilities is just so pivotal to leading the way, and then helping regulators saying, well, look, we did it. These are the things that we struggled with. These are the things that went well. And then using those as examples for other states. I really, really appreciate the utilities coming to the party there.
Would love to talk about some of the interesting use cases that you and Theodore have seen over the years. And Leah, maybe you too, some interesting perspectives that legislators have taken on this. Because as you said, it's not like one state's solutions are mirrors of another state's solutions. They're thinking about different problems and coming at this from different angles. Open to the floor. Whoever wants to jump in the water first.
Sure. I'll start on this, and this is a great group to identify some of these use cases. So, advanced conductors, I think when they first were on the scene, they were a solution to a specific problem at the time, and that would be something like a river crossing, some sort of long span, where you needed something that could go farther between structures. And since that time, what we've seen in California and Texas and other places, there have been some areas where you needed more transmission capacity. And the alternative was a new line, and that was just too difficult for some reason. And so, really see this in Europe, on TenneT system, for example, in the Netherlands, reconductoring, where it just is, almost impossible to do new transmission rights of way in some of those areas. I think the thing that we see now added to that is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve for? What's the 2026 version of a river crossing? It's I need to add power for reindustrialization in the Midwest, or which is a huge load growth too. We talk about data centers a ton, but there's actually a lot of onshoring. Who would have thought that 20 years ago? But how do I do that quickly? Because a data center is ready to go in a matter of 18 months, let's say, or a new factory is ready to go in a similar time scale. It's now affordability is what we're solving for on the speeds of power. It is if I have a capacity market like in PJM, and there's a big technical conference at FERC today all about PJM, that's clearing at $2 billion, and that goes to $16 billion. And they're still short 6 or 7 gigawatts, but there's 57 gigawatts with interconnection agreements of supply ready to go. And they just don't have the grid to get there. We see real and significant dollar impacts. So now that's the use case we're solving. And then in the world that Leah lives in the West, there's a really interesting piece of this too, which is anything and everything that can help mitigate wildfires. So when we're talking about advanced conductors and low sag, we're talking about something that can be a wildfire mitigation tool. When we're talking about a stronger core that's less resistant to breaking, we're talking about a wildfire mitigation tool. And then both with Brian's technology and the fiber optic version of advanced conductor, we're talking about transmission technology that can do things like sense wildfires in real time, or the load of the wind on the line. Do I really need to take it out of service? Or, is the wind load on that particular line really at a critical point, which is huge, if you think about how essential electricity is in the modern world. Having a California utility, for example, just say, well, we're just going to take the lines out of service because it's windy. That has tremendous impacts. So can we keep that line in service even some number of hours more before we need to take a much more drastic action like that? So I think that the use cases are really getting to those, and because of those, we see it moving from particular small cases to, if we're doing transmission planning, hey, maybe we should do an advanced conductor and maybe we can do 2 lines instead of 4 lines. Those sorts of affordability and speed issue, because that's a permitting impact too, are all really changing the culture. And we might get into this more, Paul, but I think, when we talk about speed and how much, how these things are getting adopted, to your last question with Brian, culture is so important in the utility space. It has kept things safe and on track for many decades, but it also has to change if you're going to start to deploy some of these ATTs through the legislation Leah's talking about, or the technologies Brian's talking about with their installations across the U.S.
Brian, tell us a little bit about the way you guys have solved problems for utilities. Everyone seems to love advanced transmission technologies, especially when they're solving problems.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways. Starting at the basic level, you have utilities that have identified one area, one line, one corridor that's congested. What does that mean? Normally, that congestion means one side of that congestion is going to have cheap electricity, like a oversupply of generation, and the other side is going to have very expensive electricity, where they have an undersupply of generation. Unbottlenecking that part of the grid allows you to ship that power, and it brings relief. Now, what is interesting is, people will say there's a winning side and a losing side to opening up congestion, right? So there's a little bit of politics at play there. But in general, it's the right thing to do. So you kind of get that extra lane on a busy highway kind of concept. They install that. They put that on that single conductor. When it's on that single conductor, they get benefits either during emergency conditions or day ahead planning. One example from PPL and PJM, they saved $64 million on a single line that was equipped with DLR in 1 year. Now, where does that $64 million go to? It doesn't go to the utility. It doesn't go to PPL. It doesn't go to PJM. It goes to the consumer at the end of the day. It just takes a long time to go to the consumer. because it's through rate cases and electricity pricing adaptation and all of that stuff. But then we have some other guys that are thinking about it a bit differently, and that to me is quite interesting, right? So Theodore was basically mentioning, like, let's bring some diagnostics, let's bring some sensor technology into the system. Now, if you think of building a power line, standard old power line, piece of metal in the air, that's a very expensive piece of kit. But you throw some fiber in it, you throw some sensors on it, and for a marginal increase in price, you start to get data where you previously didn't have data. And you can start to utilize that data. Now, the thing is, we're going from this mentality of N-1, right? Now, using the term N-1 is a grid term where we say we plan for, your normal system state is N, and then we can handle one extra thing that happens. So one line trips or one generator trips or whatever, N-1, right? So we're always waiting for the worst thing to happen. Well, what happens when I have a hurricane? What happens when I have wildfires? What happens when I have these low chance of occurring, high consequence events? Well, what happens is they come through and we go into not N-1 state, we go into N-100 state. And we never built the grid for that. We never planned, we never designed it. And we kind of have to accept it and solve it in the traditional ways. But with the cost of sensor data and the cost of interpreting that sensor data going down dramatically, it doesn't have to be prohibitive anymore. It really doesn't. So putting this more system-wide and catering for those, as I say, low chance of occurring, high consequence events can be cost effective if you think about it in advance, right? And I think that that's something that I would definitely encourage utilities, and there are a lot of utilities out there, but also, sometimes I think we kind of land up being quite iterative in our approach. We say, hey, let's increase the grid. Let's solve the problems one by one by one. Whereas if we actually try to take a bit more of a bulk approach to it, you might find that the incremental cost of GETs and ATTs is tiny compared to these big events that it can help with.
Leah, how are states thinking about deploying these things from what you've seen in the legislation? And have you identified any barriers that are already cropping up to preventing some deployment of ATTs?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think, there are certainly barriers just to getting the bills passed in the first place. We mentioned early on, the utilities themselves are sometimes maybe less comfortable with these technologies. They're a notoriously conservative industry. They're, want to be ultra triple sure that things are going to work before they think about deploying them. Although, of course, we have examples of many who were looking at these technologies very seriously. But that can be a factor, right? Like sometimes they come out as these bills are moving through legislatures and they say, we're not comfortable with this. We need, to make changes, or we need this to be tweaked or that to be tweaked. And obviously for all of these bills that have passed, those negotiations happen successfully. In some cases, they were on board from the beginning. In some cases, perhaps they had limited political capital. But for the most part, there was a negotiation around that. But then, of course, it's incumbent on them to actually do the evaluations that the bills are requiring them to do. And I think one of the challenges that is probably universally shared is this is a different way, perhaps, of thinking about their systems. This is a different way of thinking about how they plan for, how they model out what's needed. And sometimes it's as simple as like, our model isn't built for this. We have to update it. We have to change it. That's a doable thing. That's a solvable problem, but it is something that needs to be different. I will also point to, there was a report that just came out, a couple of ATTs related bills actually passed a couple of years ago in California, and a little bit different in California. The CAISO does transmission planning. The legislature can't tell the CAISO what to do, but they could tell the utilities and the state agencies, can you identify where these technologies could be used? And then can you go tell CAISO about it so they can factor it into their planning? And then there was a report that just came out that sort of looked at, what did they find when they did that exercise? And they found a couple of things. One is that reliability and economics traditionally had been looked at separately. If you're doing transmission for an economic reason or transmission for a reliability reason, those would be treated differently. The report authors said you really should be looking at those together because you will find more places where ATTs can be effective and used and deployed. And then another thing that they looked at was, you really need to look at your whole system. You can't just go line by line. If you're going line by line, you're going to get different answers than when you look at the system as a whole and where you can make those changes. And that gets back to some of that modeling, right? Are they set up to look at their whole system in the way that needs to be looked at to sort of find the answers that we're looking for here, or do they have to rethink that?
Do you think there's federal intervention that's necessary here? We mentioned near the start of the program that FERC had mentioned ATTs in its show cause orders to the larger grid operators earlier this year. Is this something the states can handle? Or do you think the feds need to step in and FERC needs to say this has to happen because we're in a tough spot right
I'll take my shot at this, and Lee and Brian may have different takes or different glosses on this, but I think the short answer, yes. I think that the federal involvement is needed, and I was going to say helpful, but I think it's a little more than that. I think it's needed, and why is that the case? Because there are a couple things. One that I mentioned is, it's not nefarious. It is, I have my NERC standards, my TPL, they're called my transmission planning standards. This is what I need to plan to. And if I'm a utility, I've been told for decades that if I do anything that looks like it's more than the bare minimum, that I'm doing something called gold plating. And that is frowned upon. And so we have gone from a mentality of very slow or incremental load growth, please don't overbuild the grid, to, oh my gosh, we can't add capacity on the grid fast enough. Why haven't we optimized right-of-ways? Why aren't we making the most of the current grid? Why can't we add lines faster? All of that. So for FERC to, I think first in, for example, Order 1920, which was a big planning order, we talked a little bit in the conversation we were having a little while ago with Leah about how, these things have kind of iteratively gotten better and more direct. That was very much a consider in the process kind of set of language. The orders that just came out to the RTOs are very much, you must look at these things. And that sort of direction, I think, is helpful if you're utility leadership saying, is there a risk to doing this? I mean, I hear people saying they want us to do this. If you see where the jurisdiction lies in the Federal Power Act, transmission rates are FERC jurisdictional, and that's why the federal involvement is important. There's some other bills being put through Congress in different drafts. One just passed out of committee unanimously on Wednesday this week, something called the High Capacity Grid Act from Representative Fedorchak in North Dakota, who was a regulator for many years. And I think whether it's the FERC orders or draft legislation like that at the federal level, it's all aiming towards that friction point of culture to say, don't worry about this. This is what we want you to do. Not only do we want you to do it, the point of lesser friction is going to be to look at advanced transmission technologies. So I think that is game changing, and it really augments what the states are doing. So those two pieces together, I think, are really complementary. They're both going in the same direction, so that helps too, right? But it kind of goes to the real interesting element here, which is we started some of your comments, Paul, around it's bipartisan. This is Republicans and Democrats, red states and blue states. This is bicameral, bipartisan in Congress, all 5 commissioners singing from the same hymnal in those FERC orders, right? So I think all of those pieces moving together make it much more likely that we are at a moment where in the US, we will really start to see more of the adoption of these technologies.
Leah, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think Theodore really touched on this. The grid does have shared jurisdiction, federal and state. And so I think part of the reason there is a need for federal engagement here, federal involvement, is because there are parts of this that the federal government oversees, right? FERC is in charge of the RTOs and ISOs. Except for ERCOT, they do transmission planning, right? If you're going to be thinking about these things in the transmission planning part of how you're building out the grid, right? If that's the area where you're doing it, then FERC needs to be the one telling, PJM or MISO or whoever, this is what you need to be considering and how you need to consider it. the states certainly do have a role. The states, can be telling their own utilities, we want you to be considering these things. And then the utilities can go back to their, RTOs and say, hey, we gotta do this. Like, you have to help us out. So there's sort of that interplay in both directions. But I think it is really much more effective when, kind of everybody is on board with, here's where we want to get to. Let's all row in the same direction. And, each person or entity can oversee their part of it.
This is a huge conversation about multiple technologies and lots of different pieces of legislation, and we could talk probably for hours before this panel of experts would get bored with the conversation. I can't say the same for our listeners and everyone who has to download a multiple-hour podcast. So with that in mind, we're going to take a turn toward the exit here. And with that, I would love to get some parting thoughts from each of you. Maybe something we didn't get a chance to cover, or a point that you really wanted to hammer home for everyone that's watching and listening, and has probably learned a lot about the state of ATTs and GETs, especially in the U.S. right now. Brian, we haven't heard from you in a bit. Let's start with you.
Yeah, well, it is a complicated problem, but I think it's not all doom and gloom. I think there's been some real good progress in the US. I think on the regulatory side, they haven't been sitting on their hands. They've been doing a lot. There's a lot of discussion around this. That's great. And that's even the discussion, even the hints at moving in the right direction there, incentivizing these things, gets utilities thinking about it, gets utilities thinking, like, if I take a move in this direction, which I think is right, I know I'm going to get support from the government on this. And I think that's huge. Seeing some of the government funding also coming into play, the Spark Fund, for example, I think that's really encouraging. Huge for the vendors to be able to contribute there. So a huge amount of positivity. Is there more work to do? Yes, of course. But I think I just want to encourage the utilities that have taken the step, despite it not maybe being perfect, right? And I would encourage them to continue to make those steps. There are things that are just inherently right to do for the consumer. And we are all consumers at the end of the day. This is our grid. We pay for this grid, right? So we don't want to be affected with inaffordability. So just an encouragement to say, let's keep doing the right things from the utility side. Let's try to route the money to the people that benefit and the people that pay. If we can try to link that on a regulatory front, I encourage that work and say, thank you for the work so far.
Any parting wisdom you'd like to leave us with, Theodore?
So I think what Brad just said is great. I, would just add that, kind of coming back to where I started on, the supply and the demand of this historic demand, historic supply. I think one of the things that's so important for your listeners to understand is, sometimes people will talk about, what Brian and I are talking about is, these are new technologies. I mean, these are widely deployed technologies at this point, with a few decades of field operation. As I mentioned, the designs keep innovating and getting better. But they're tried and true. They're widely deployed. There are many deployments in the US. And I think, the parting thought I would have around this is, we're at a moment where we need to move away from what we often do in the utility space, which is very incremental, right? We like to put our toe in the water and move slowly. This is not a great time for that. We won't see the benefits if we do that. Like Spark, that Brian just went, is great, but it's it's $2.8 or something billion, and with the private contribution, getting up at 4.5 or 5 billion of investment. That's wonderful, but if you think about grid costs, that's a small portion. UC Berkeley did a study in spring of 2024 on advanced conductors, just that piece of it, and found 98% or so of the US grid is a good candidate for reconductoring. And if you did that, what it would mean for consumer savings. The consumer savings were huge. Grid Strategies has studies too about consumer savings from transmission investment. And so when we look at the AI demand growth, the reindustrialization demand growth, just trying to lower energy from more efficient generating resources. And there's a lot of hand-wringing in the space. I think it's such a moment for us to say, look, we have the technology. It's really just a matter of the will. And everything we've talked about, I think, is going in that direction to changing the culture, the mindset, the planning rules, so that maybe we can move from that very incremental, here's a little deployment here, here's a little pilot here, to this is the first thing we look at in transmission planning. How can I, double a line and not build a new one? How can I build a new one and have it move twice as much power? Whatever those outputs are, starting there as opposed to an afterthought after a whole bunch of work has already been done. I think that will make a tremendous difference to the deployment of ATTs in this country.
Bring us home, Leah. Your final thoughts.
Sure. Well, like Theodore was just saying, I mean, the technology is really there, and the policy and regulatory problems that we've talked about, they're very solvable. And this is really a space that when you look at sort of the vast range of energy policy, this is one that has relatively few political problems too. I mean, there are people really excited, decision makers, stakeholders across the board, excited about the promise of these technologies and just looking to figure out, okay, how can we get more of them? How do I get more of them in my state? How do I get more of them on my local grid? There is a ton we need to do for our grid, lots of different problems we have to tackle. This is what we like to call a no regret solution, and we've seen really broad support because of it. Environmental organizations, business communities in these states where these bills have passed, labor, some utilities, and lawmakers across the ideological spectrum. And they've all been in support of these things because this is, in fact, that no regret solution that's really going to make a difference and can do it quickly and affordably.
I feel like that has been a pervasive theme throughout our conversation today. What a no-brainer some of this stuff is. And even the legislators that are being approached with these topics are kind of scratching their heads like, why weren't we doing this before? So if it makes that much sense to everybody that lays eyes on it, I think it makes a lot of sense for our grid and can help us in the short and long term. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to spend with me here on the Factor This Policycast, presented in partnership with our pals at Advanced Energy United. One last thank you to Theodore Paradise over at CTC Global, Brian Barry at Heimdall Power as well, and of course, Leah with Advanced Energy United. Really value your perspectives on this topic. I'm sure we're not going to be done talking about it. As Theodore said, 98% of the grid could use a facelift, so let's grab a shovel and get out there and do it. If you enjoyed the Policycast, we do this every other week. These episodes go live on Thursdays. Stick around. We're going to be doing a whole slate of episodes we got planned out through the summer and fall. If you did like it, please actually click the like button. Those metrics matter. Subscribe, leave a little feedback if you like, and we'll see you back here very soon for another edition. Until then, be good, people. Take care of yourselves.